All right, the UK's 2025 budget has dropped. And look, it's this huge, complicated document that's going to impact pretty much everyone. So what's actually in it? Well, we've waded through the whole thing to pull out the key details you really need to know.
So let's get right to it. The big question, the one you probably care about most is, how does all of this actually affect your wallet? To figure that out, we're going to break this whole thing down into 5 key pieces. We're going to start with the big picture, the economic challenge. Then we'll get into what they're doing about the cost of living, dive into some major tax system reforms, look at changes to public services, and wrap up with the government's big bet on growth. Okay, first up, the UK's economic challenge. Let's really dig into the why behind all these decisions, because honestly, every single thing in this budget is a reaction to some pretty serious headwinds the country's facing. And you don't have to take my word for it. The government's own budget document puts it pretty bluntly. They straight up admit that for a lot of working people and businesses, the economy just isn't working well. This right here, this is the core problem they're trying to solve.
So what are the root causes here? Well, the budget points to 4 big challenges. First, productivity has been weak, really since the financial crisis. That's a huge deal. Second, government borrowing is sky high. We're talking 3rd highest in the G7. Ouch. Third, and you've definitely felt this, there's a massive cost of living squeeze. And to top it all off, the economic forecast just got revised, and not in a good way. Tax revenues are expected to be lower than they thought.
And that revised forecast? Yeah, it's a really big deal. We're talking about a £16 billion shortfall. Basically, because productivity is lower, the economy grows slower, and that means the government collects way less in taxes than it planned for. That is a massive hole they now have to plug.
Okay, so with that pretty grim backdrop, let's move on to what they're doing to help right now. This section is all about tackling the cost of living with some direct relief for your bills.
First up, a big one, energy bills. The plan is to knock an average of £150 off household energy bills. Now, the catch is, this doesn't actually kick in until April 2026. Next, for anyone who takes the train. Regulated rail fares are being frozen for 1 year. For some commuters, that could mean a saving of up to £300.
And if you're a driver, that 5p cut to fuel duty, it's being extended again all the way through to August 2026.
But it's not just about energy and transport. There's a bit more support packed in here. We're also seeing a 1-year freeze on prescription charges in England. The national living wage is getting a bump up to £12.71 an hour in April 2026. And for pensioners, the state pension triple lock is being maintained, which means a 4.8% increase is coming.
All right, let's talk about the big one, reforming the tax system. The government's really trying to do 3 things here. Get contributions up, make the whole thing feel a bit fairer, and modernize it for today's world.
So this brings us to a really important kind of sneaky concept called fiscal drag. Honestly, this might be the single biggest tax policy in the entire budget. Here's how it works. The government is freezing the income tax and national insurance thresholds until 2031. So even if your pay goes up just to keep pace with inflation, you could get pushed into a higher tax bracket. It's a way for them to raise more tax money without actually announcing they're raising the rates.
Now, to try and make things feel fairer, the budget takes aim at wealth and assets. The idea is to balance out that fiscal drag we just talked about. So what does that look like? Well, there's a new council tax surcharge for homes worth over £2 million. We're also seeing higher tax rates on income you get from property, dividends and savings. And there are some changes to reliefs for things like pension, salary sacrifice and employee ownership trusts.
And speaking of modernization, here's a huge one for the future of driving. Right now, petrol and diesel cars pay fuel duty at the pump, but as we all switch to electric cars, that tax revenue disappears. So starting in 2028, a whole new system is coming in for EVs. They'll pay a new mileage-based charge, what they're calling EVID, so everyone contributes to road upkeep. Okay, so we've seen how they're raising the money. Now, how are they spending it on public services? This is all about a mix of new investment, a big push for efficiency, and some really significant welfare reforms. Probably the single biggest headline coming out of the welfare changes is this. They are scrapping the 2-child limit in universal credit. And the projected impact is just massive. The government's own numbers say this one change alone will lift 450,000 children out of poverty. That is a huge number. So the natural next question is, how is this being paid for? Well, the budget outlines a few key areas. They're reforming tax breaks on the mobility scheme,
cracking down harder on tax and benefit fraud and errors, and they'll be increasing the number of face-to-face health assessments for people claiming benefits.
All right, there's also a new efficiency drive across government departments. They're looking for almost £5 billion in savings, but here's the crucial part, as you can see. While everyone has to find savings, only the NHS and the Ministry of Defense actually get to keep the money they save and reinvest it. For every other department, those savings go straight back to the Treasury.
And for the NHS, that reinvestment is going to be focused on a 3-step plan. Step 1, establish 250 new neighborhood health centers. Step 2, pump an extra £300 million into technology to make things run smoother. And step 3, set a pretty ambitious target to increase NHS productivity by 2% every single year. And all of this, the tax changes, the spending, the reforms, it all leads to this final section, the big bet on growth. This is the government's ultimate goal. Everything we've just talked about is designed to feed into this one single ambition.
So, what's the actual game plan for growth? Well, it's a mix of short and long-term moves. Right now, they're protecting public investment in infrastructure. For the ongoing part, they're reforming planning laws to get things built faster. And looking to the future, they're backing businesses with tax incentives and RMD reforms, and putting $1.5 billion into skills training and a youth guarantee.
But after all of that, what's the forecast? What does the independent watchdog, the Office for Budget Responsibility, actually think is going to happen? Well, as you can see, they're predicting pretty modest and steady growth. We're looking at about 1.4 to 1.5% from 2026 onwards. So that's the, let's call it the sober reality check to all those big ambitions.
And that really brings us to the final multi-billion-pound question, doesn't it? We've seen the plan, the tax reforms, the spending priorities, the big bet on growth. But will this whole complicated mix of policies actually deliver the kind of growth the UK really needs to improve life for everyone? Well, that is the big unknown.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we have the Budget 2025 document you shared with us, and we're going to really break it down. We want to focus on 2 core things.
Right.
First, the immediate relief for households.
Right.
And second, the big high-stakes strategy to fix the UK's, well, its productivity problem.
Exactly. This document is a real balancing act. On one hand, you've got this clear path towards fiscal stability, which is, a key goal. But underneath all the headlines, you can see the government is being forced to make some pretty tough, maybe even overdue decisions to address, a decade of underperformance?
Oh, so our mission today is to really get under the skin of the trade-offs they've chosen. Let's start with the good news, the economic status check.
Okay, yeah, there is some positive news. The growth forecast for 2025 has been upgraded. It's gone from 1%, which was the prediction back in March, up to 1.5%.
And 1.5% might not sound like a huge number, but in context, it's pretty significant.
It is a significant shift, and the Treasury is very keen to point out that this puts Britain on course to be the second fastest growing economy in the G7 next year.
And the other big piece is inflation, right?
All right.
That seems to be easing up.
It does. It's coming down. We saw it fall to 3.6% in October from 3.8% in September. That gives the Bank of England a lot more room to maneuver.
And that has real-world consequences, especially for homeowners.
Absolutely. The Bank of England has responded. They've cut interest rates 5 times since the start of this parliament. That feeds directly into consumer confidence, borrowing costs, all of it.
Okay, so that sounds like, the ship is steadying after a storm. But that brings us to the real tension in this whole document.
Yes.
Despite all this progress, the official line admits the economy is still, and I'm quoting here, not working well enough for a lot of people.
And I think the most chilling detail in all of this source material comes from the Office of Budget Responsibility, the OBR.
Their revision on productivity.
Yes. What's fascinating is they didn't just tweak a number. They fundamentally revised down their whole assumption about the UK's long-term potential.
And that has a huge knock-on effect.
A huge one. That downward revision, just by itself, reduces the government's expected revenue by around £16 billion in 2029-30.
$16 billion. That is just an astronomical hole to fill. And that's not a temporary problem. That's a structural shortfall.
Exactly. It tells you the foundations of the economy are weaker than everyone thought. That $16 billion is the phantom cost this budget is trying to cover before they can even think about new spending.
Which means they have to focus on long-term growth. But before they can get to that, they have to deal with the immediate political reality.
The cost of living squeeze. You can't talk about the future if people can't afford the present.
Right. So let's unpack the measures they designed to help households right now. Energy costs are first on the list.
Yes. They're bringing in a package that should remove about 150 pounds of costs on average from household energy bills. That kicks in from April 2026.
Okay, but how are they doing that? Because these things are usually baked into our bills in really complex ways.
They are, and it's important for you, the listener, to understand the mechanism here. They're ending something called the energy company obligation,
Okay.
and they're also funding 75% of the cost of the old legacy renewables obligation for 3 years.
Can you just quickly demystify those two for us? What are they?
Sure. Think of them as hidden policy costs that suppliers just pass on to you. The energy company obligation was to improve energy efficiency for low-income households, and the renewables obligation was a subsidy to kickstart green energy years ago.
So they're taking those costs off our bills and putting them onto the government's books instead.
Essentially, yes. It's a targeted subsidy. It gives direct relief, and it's even forecast to cut headline inflation by over 0.2 percentage points in 2026-27.
And they're doing something similar with transport costs, too. A freeze on rail fares.
A total freeze on all regulated rail fares in England for 1 year, starting March 2026. That's the first time that's happened in 30 years.
And for some commuters, that's a lot of money.
Oh, yeah. If you're on one of the most expensive routes, it could save you up to £300 a year, real cash in your pocket. And for drivers, they're extending the 5p fuel duty cut until the end of August 2026.
So that's another, almost £90 for the average car-owning family?
Around $89, yeah, compared to what was planned before.
Now, let's get to what is probably the biggest social policy change in the whole document, the one that got all the attention.
Welfare reform.
Specifically, tackling child poverty by removing the two-child limit in universal credit.
This is a monumental intervention. I mean, you just have to look at the projections. This single change is expected to lift 450,000 children out of poverty.
450,000.
And when you combine it with other things, like expanding free school meals, that number climbs to about 550,000 children.
That's a staggering figure. The document says it's the largest expected reduction in child poverty over a parliament since records began.
It is. And what it signals is an acknowledgement that child poverty has these immense long-term costs. For the economy, for society. It's an investment in future productivity, even if it's expensive now.
And they're also increasing the national living wage.
That's right. It's going up by 4.1% to £12.71 an hour for workers 21 and over.
So you've got this immediate pressure being eased, some really big social changes being made, but relief costs money. Which brings us to the big question.
Where's the money coming from?
Exactly. How are they paying for all that?
Well, this is critical because they've committed to their fiscal rules, which means day-to-day spending has to be met by revenues. No borrowing for that.
So tax increases.
Targeted tax increases, yes. And it's all centered on this theme of fairness and modernizing the tax base. They're explicitly going after asset wealth.
Right. The argument is that income from things like property, savings, dividends, it hasn't really been taxed as heavily as the national insurance someone pays on their salary.
And they're looking to narrow that gap. Taxes on property, dividend, and savings income are all going up. That's projected to raise £2.2 billion by 2029-30.
But the policy that really illustrates this fairness idea is the new high-value council tax surcharge, the HVCTS.
Yes. This is a surcharge on residential properties in England worth over £2 million starting in April 2028.
And the logic they use to sell this is fascinating. They point out a huge flaw in the current system.
They do. Because property valuations haven't been properly updated in decades, the document highlights that an average Band D family home often pays more in council tax than a £10 million property in Westminster.
So a semi in the suburbs is effectively subsidizing a mansion in central London.
It's a very politically powerful argument, and this surcharge is designed to fix that. It starts at £2,500 a year, goes up to £7,500 for properties over $5 million. It affects less than 1% of homes.
So it raises revenue, but it's also a big political statement about who should pay.
Precisely.
They're also looking at modernizing tax because of technology, specifically the shift to electric cars.
Yes, the EV transition is great for the climate, but it's a disaster for the Treasury. Fuel duty receipts are set to halve by the 2030s.
And fuel duty is what pays for the roads.
It's the core funding mechanism. So the solution they've come up with is the Electric Vehicle Excise Duty, or EVED. It's a modest, self-reported per-mile levy for electric and plug-in hybrid cars, starting in April 2028.
And it's important to stress, this isn't a new tax on EVs out of nowhere. It's designed to replace the fuel duty they don't pay.
Exactly. It's about maintaining that funding for roads. The charge is set to be about half the rate of fuel duty paid by an average petrol or diesel driver. So it works out to about £240 a year or £20 a month for the average EV driver.
So it keeps the incentive to go electric, but makes sure the funding for roads doesn't disappear.
That's the idea.
We also see some targeted tax reforms to get more money into business, specifically scaling companies.
Right. These are changes to things like the enterprise management incentives, venture capital trusts, and the enterprise investment scheme. EMI, VCT, EIS.
And what do those schemes actually do?
They're vital. They're all designed to incentivize risk capital, basically money, to flow into small, high-growth, high-risk companies. EMI, for instance, lets small firms attract talent with tax-advantaged share options.
And by raising the limits, they're hoping to unlock more private investment.
Yes, to tackle that big, overarching productivity problem we started with.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting for me. The long-term strategy. Waging war on that £16 billion revenue hole through massive capital spending.
This is the big bet. It's a huge bet on the supply side of the economy. They're committing to maintain public investment at the highest sustained level in 4 decades.
Over $120 billion in additional capital spending over the Parliament.
And a lot of that is focused on infrastructure and, crucially, planning reform. We've needed that for years. For instance, there's almost $900 million just to complete the Lower Thames crossing.
And the new planning and infrastructure bill is meant to speed everything up. Roads, reservoirs, energy projects.
The goal is to cut delivery times for major infrastructure by up to a year. And when you think about the cost of delays, saving a year on a massive project is transformative.
And we've already seen some results from early reforms, haven't we?
We have. The changes to the National Planning Policy Framework have already delivered 170,000 extra homes and are forecast to boost GDP by 0.2% by 2029-30. So speed really is critical.
A key part of this long-term growth plan is energy security. And that means nuclear.
It does. Walfa in Anglesey, North Wales is confirmed as the site for the UK's first small modular reactor project, an SMR.
That's a huge deal for the local area.
Huge. It's expected to support up to 3,000 jobs. But maybe even more impactful for the finances is how they've reclassified nuclear energy itself.
Ah, yes. It's now officially green.
It's been added to the green financing framework, so it can now be funded by things like green gilts and green savings bonds.
And S&P rated it dark green, which is their highest rating.
That sends a massive signal to global investors that this technology is seen as a critical part of a sustainable future. It just unlocks vast new streams of investment.
And beyond the heavy industry, they're still protecting the science and innovation budget.
Yes, despite all the fiscal pressure elsewhere, annual R&D investment is still growing. It's set to hit $22.6 billion by 2029-30.
So if we connect all these dots, this whole growth strategy seems to rely heavily on making it work outside of London and the Southeast.
That regional focus is absolutely critical. You have to address the geographical inequality that's driving a lot of this productivity gap.
So we see money for a northern growth corridor and the Oxford to Cambridge growth corridor.
Right. They're even identifying specific sites, like Tempsford, as a potential new town within that Oxcam arc.
And they're getting creative with how they fund this locally, like with the Leeds City Fund.
Yes, making it a 25-year business rates retention zone.
In simple terms, what does that mean?
It means Leeds City Council gets to keep 100% of the growth in business rates above a certain baseline. It creates a predictable, long-term funding stream that they can invest directly in local transport and housing without having to go cap in hand to central government.
It's an incentive for them to drive their own growth.
Exactly.
Now, on the other side of the ledger, there's a big new efficiency and savings target for all government departments. £4.9 billion by 2030-31.
Ambitious.
Very. Given how much is riding on these savings to meet the fiscal rules, how realistic is that? Is it just kicking the can down the road?
It requires huge political discipline. They are making some specific cuts to show they're serious, like getting rid of police and crime commissioners and cutting about 5,000 councillor roles.
Which saves how much?
About $250 million over 5 years. But the real heavy lifting, the billions, has to come from overhauling bureaucracy, and that is always, always complex.
And the NHS is absolutely central to this whole productivity push, isn't it?
It has to be. There's $300 million of new capital investment just for NHS technology to drive that shift from analog to digital systems. And they're planning 250 new neighborhood health centers.
But the efficiency goal they've set for the NHS is maybe the single most ambitious target in the entire budget.
Increasing NHS productivity by 2% per year, if they can actually do that, it would unlock 17 billion of savings over 3 years.
Which they've promised to reinvest back into the health service.
Yes. The whole investment strategy, the new tech, the new centers, it's all designed to make that 2% lift possible.
So to recap this whole balancing act, this budget is funding immediate relief, like removing the two-child limit, mainly by raising taxes on assets. At the same time, they're sticking to their fiscal rules, but protecting and even increasing this huge pot of money for long-term investment.
It's a complicated picture, but the threat that hangs over everything is that slowdown in productivity we've seen since the global financial crisis. The figure that should haunt every policymaker is this. If productivity had just continued growing at the same rate it did between 1998 and 2007, GDP per capita today could have been around £15,000 higher.
£15,000 higher for every person.
That's the true scale of the wealth gap that this whole strategy is trying desperately to close.
So this deep dive really reveals a fundamental shift. Funding long-term growth through massive investment paid for by targeted tax increases. You've seen the huge bets they're placing on nuclear energy, on radical planning reform, on regional growth funds. So the question for you to think about is this. Given the OBR's stark warning on productivity, which of these big investment areas do you think holds the greatest potential to actually close that £15,000 cap? Something to chew on until our next deep dive.